Hello and welcome to the SUNY Potsdam Learning Design Podcast, the show where we talk everything educational technology. My name is Cailey Roberts and I'm an educational technology specialist student at SUNY Potsdam. In today's episode, we are going to explore the future of learning with Dr. Karen Caldwell. She's a lifelong learner who promotes learning out loud and having an itchy brain. Thank you so much for being here and coming on today and to share with us your insights on educational technology.
Thank you, Cailey. I am so excited to be here.
So to get things started, I wanted to talk about your background and some of your trademarks. So can you give us a little introduction and talk about how you got into this field?
All right. So I'm from Canada and I studied and lived and worked overseas for a really long time. I also studied in Canada. And that was kind of the necessity behind identifying emerging and existing technology so that I could live my life and get jobs I needed and stay in touch with my family. And there's also a curiosity element. So necessity and curiosity have kind of woven together to make me sort of take risks, to try things, both out of this fear, which is related to curiosity slightly, but also the necessity. So it's been a dual role. Those two concepts, curiosity and necessity, that have made me use technology to the point where I'm able to use it in my teaching, hopefully effectively, but also demonstrate for students that it's not this clean, straightforward, smooth process, that we're all going to have hiccups, and that's part of the joy
Absolutely,
of emerging technologies. Yes.
definitely. So you live by the notion of being a lifelong learner, and that's something you've talked about in all of the classes that we've had together. How has having that mentality helped guide you through your journey?
I would say it's an identity that allows me to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
I have always been super curious. That was some of the feedback that my teachers told my parents when I was younger. They said she always asks questions, make her stop. And so I think just not being afraid to say I don't know, and who here wonders the same thing, and let's figure it out together.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really the mentality that has gotten me to where I am today. And I've worked with a lot of people who will whisper behind the scenes, or could you ask them this question? And I'll say, well, you didn't know either? Oh, cool. So I think I'm just not afraid to show that I don't know something. And that just means that I'll be continually curious. And I'll just quickly mention a personal note. My mother always talked about how her parents and her aunts and uncles all experienced either senile dementia or Alzheimer's, and she was obsessed with keeping her marbles, for lack of a better word. And she used to read 4 books a week. She was exceptionally smart either way, and I didn't have that ability in school to catch things really quickly. But I did see her, no matter what she was doing, always, always learning. And my dad did not finish high school even, yet he's one of the wisest, smartest men I know. And he sits and watches mostly nonfiction TV with a dictionary beside him. So I'll go over there and he'll ask me questions, and he'll have written down stuff that he has seen on TV. So just, I think growing up with that, where both of my parents are curious, but they're not university educated, they're not, so I'm a non-traditional learner, first generation. Yet I have super curious, lifelong learning parents as well, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
brothers and sisters. So I think that's part of it too.
Yeah. And I think with the how you talk about how like if you have a question, somebody else is probably has the same question. I automatically think of like our virtual cafe. Like if you have a question,
Exactly.
jump in there because you're not going to be the only person that's wondering it.
Exactly, Kaylee. And I will share with you that for every question you see there, I receive 4 or 5 by email. And of course, I welcome them. I tell the students, great job for asking a question, and they may find that a strange response.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, at the same time, everybody else will probably have that same question. So if you could pose it in the virtual cafe, that'd be great. And then I respect whatever they decide to do after that. But I like that you recognize that because it's really meant to be that natural spot where you have all sorts of questions.
You also did a TEDx SUNY Potsdam where you described your learning out loud manifesto, which I love. Um, could you tell us about like that experience a little bit and like where that ideology was born and what it like really means?
So SUNY Potsdam used to hold this every 2 years, I think, and Dr. Tony Beatrice recorded maybe one of the most watched videos of that type of TED Talk. So it's a TEDx, which is a special kind. And he encouraged me and my colleagues to give it a try. And if Tony suggests it, I will give it a try because of what he means to me as a colleague, as a leader in my organization. So I was terrified and I thought they wouldn't accept my application. And at the time, my approach I was calling knowledge mobilization, which is something I learned about while I was doing my doctorate. Another student was studying that in her school. And it's really about how educators, the original use of knowledge mobilization that was introduced to me was how educators can set up a learning community by taking research and breaking it down, parsing it, and figuring out what it means to them in the classroom, and then, sharing that more widely. And I think that's a great concept, but I think what's most important is that that communication goes in both ways because research typically is in this highly controlled environment that does not represent the complexity of a classroom. So when I looked up knowledge mobilization, I saw that in Canada, for example, for a researcher to get a social sciences grant, you have to have a knowledge mobilization plan in place, which means get your content, get your findings out there in plain language, in accessible formats, and get dialogues going. So that really excited me, the notion of having a conversation going because knowledge doesn't flow in one direction. So that was the original concept. Tony said, "Why don't you give it a try?" And then at the pitch session, there were lots of people who had applied and came in to pitch. We each got to work with a different person who had done it before, and I got paired with Tony. As soon as I started talking, he was like, "No, simplify it." And I was like, "So knowledge mobilization, blah, 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 blah." He was like, "No, what does that mean?" No, so he was really the coach I needed at that point. And I kind of stumbled, sputtered, and didn't ever really get my thought out. I had 3 minutes and I didn't even get to my main thought. So on the drive home, I thought, Karen, how would you explain this to your nephew? And I just said, it's about learning out loud. It's about not being afraid to share your research findings, but learning out loud means someone else in the room is learning and you're hearing them and you're interacting somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And just one last point is that there's another approach called working out loud that I had already heard of. So the notion of out loud was not new to me. John Stemmer is someone who has coined this and is researching it. And it's really about if I am a researcher at Bosch, I'm an engineer, and there's someone in Brazil who's trying to tackle that same problem. Why don't we form this natural learning community
Mm-hmm.
and we work out loud so we solve similar problems together in these small communities? So, sorry, it's John Stepper. So he organizes those and he sets them up in their global problem fixing and making community groups called Working Out Loud. So that's kind of where that came from. And it was a terrifying experience where technology failed me
Oh,
during the
really?
TED Talk. So, oh yeah. So
You
normally,
would have
normally
never
you have it
known.
tell. Thank you. I truly was terrified, but as you know, when you try something you're afraid of, you're so happy afterwards, right?
Yes.
So, yeah. Yeah, so what the technology that failed was the teleprompter didn't work. So most people, everybody has their slides, but they have their key content in front of them. And I only heard about that not functioning maybe 1 or 2 days before. And it's a long session,
Yeah.
right? That you're up there. So, but it was fine. Yeah, it ended up working out okay, but
I have watched it many times. I think it went great, and I would have never known that there was any technical difficulties behind it. So you're also known for your itchy brain blog and the idea of having an itchy brain. Could you tell us a little bit about that kind of and what it means too?
so our brains are pattern seeking. So as a baby, you start to see these four-legged animals around you, and over time, its brain, the baby forms patterns and recognizes that that's a dog, but this four-legged entity is a cat. And so when we are learning and we start to notice patterns, we might not even remember where this concept came from because didn't I learn that in another course? Or didn't my mom mention something about that? So it's like your brain is on fire when you welcome that type of feeling. So your brain reacts in two different ways when it faces something that's unknown. So if you feel like you're going to lose face or you're going to be seen as not knowing or not an expert or whatever you identify as, if you're an expert in the classroom. So you can either respond with stress, at which point cortisol is coursing through your brain and you're in a fight or flight survival mode. And it's like knocking on wood. You don't information doesn't come in, you're not in learning mode. On the other hand, if you can over time help yourself be curious about this thing you don't know and be vulnerable, you actually have neurotransmitters that are like turning your brain into a sponge. And I won't go into great details now unless you want me to, but there's really compelling research that when your brain is in that state, even if something is flashed in front of your face that has nothing to do with the thing you're curious about, you'll remember this thing that was in your line of vision 5 weeks later, 6 weeks later, and you weren't even conscious of it. So there's something physical, chemical, electrical that happens in our brains when it's itchy, when you're curious. So it's really something to nurture. The term came about when I was doing my doctorate, and I was maybe 20, if that, maybe 20, 30 years older than my peers. And that didn't bother me at all. But I also decided I wasn't going to be a poser. And I think that's a word that you might remember from my courses as well as don't pretend you don't pretend you know, and don't be a poser. So I started asking a lot of questions, and I also disagreed with a lot of the content I was reading. And I would maybe make it more gentle by saying, this is making my brain itchy. And that was sort of a gentle way to start a conversation that might otherwise be uncomfortable if I was saying, I don't quite agree with what you said about charter schools, for example. So it was initially a way for me to open conversations that might be uncomfortable.
Thank you for sharing like the science behind it. I feel like we don't really talk a lot about that, but I know like you have your doctorate in it and you have so much knowledge on this, and we don't really talk a lot about the science of it in class. So it's really interesting to like go beyond kind of like what we're learning and also learn more of like the actual like what's going on in our brain. On the topic of having an itchy brain, and as we are exploring the future of learning together, I'm curious to learn about your opinions and understandings on emerging learning technologies. Can you share some emerging learning technologies from when you were first getting started in your education and compare them to something that we might see like either in a classroom or in a distance education setting today?
Okay, great. So um, I would say if we think of a continuum, and it's not really a continuum, but it's analog to digital. And so I remember in my school, we had the kind of copier that I forget the name of it, but it was a drum, and you had to turn a crank, and it would crank out these handouts, worksheets that were in this purple colored font. So that was a photocopier before photocopiers came. And so I was born in '67, and I'm 57 years old. And so those were much more analog. There was nothing digital about it. And then projector was like this really cool, exciting thing if the teacher was bringing that in, like this light flashed up on the screen. and then a TV in high school.
Mhm.
And so that was really cool. And then a typewriter. I learned on a clunky mechanical typewriter, which I'm so grateful for today because I can, smoke comes off this keyboard when I'm
I'm
typing.
sure. I'm sure.
Then I started working really at a young age. And so I worked on a switchboard at a hospital. I think I told you a story
Yes,
about
you
my
were.
sisters and I
Yeah.
terrorizing each other. And so that literally the day I started was 1 week into them using this digital phone system where they didn't pull out the cable and put it into another hole. They had just switched over. And I promptly poured my coffee on the new console. So that was
On the first
memorable.
day?
Yeah.
Oh man.
So there was that. So memorable moments I think I talked about in my distance education class was seeing a facsimile, a fax machine
Mhm.
work. And that's part of education. I used it when I worked in the telecommunications office at my university, which was in Montreal. But also it was just part of how schools were able to start connecting more and sharing information. I was really into sports, so I know that my high school used the fax machine to arrange events, for example.
Mhm.
Um, so in university, just as I was graduating with my teaching degree, so I had been in 5.5 years because I was in a 4-year program, and then I did a year and a half to get my teaching certificate. And on almost my last day of classes, our professor told us about this thing called electronic mail. So that was cool. And I
That's
was working in
awesome.
telecommunication. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that
Like
is
you're
so cool.
leaving. Yeah. And then my first job was overseas. I didn't get
Mhm.
my required time in classes here in Canada because I went overseas to South Korea, got my first email account. So that's when sort of, let's say around 1995 is when the digital side kind of took over my education life. So it
Yep.
was no longer analog, but more digital. And then things kind of accelerated just out of need. So if you remember at the beginning, you asked me about, emerging technologies and my experience. It's been based on curiosity and necessity.
Yep.
And I needed to stay in touch with family, but also I needed to demonstrate my use or my value added as an educator, competing with a lot of people for jobs overseas. So I always had to at least be able to talk the talk. And when they asked me to demonstrate, it was usually almost like slapstick comedy, but that's okay. I managed to get through. No one lost an eye. Um, so yeah, it's really using technology only in the service of a purpose, not me going out and saying, "Oh, what's this thing called a mobile phone?" I remember someone when I was living in Turkey coming to my door and saying, "Oh yeah, so and so is going to meet us there. I got a text," and I said, "What the hell is a text? What are you talking about?" And I didn't get a mobile phone, so I'm not an early adopter.
Mhm.
It's only when it serves a purpose. I'm kind of a naysayer when it comes to something that's brand new and shiny.
Mhm. Oh, that's
Yeah,
that's really interesting. We're gonna talk about the fusion of innovation later, so I'm glad you brought that up. That's really interesting. So,
yeah,
in
I
your
agree.
opinion, what distinguishes an emerging learning technology from being or from established ones in the context of education? So, like, when does it transition from this is new and emerging to this is just an everyday piece of technology in a classroom?
I love that question. And I will say it's all context based because of the equity and access to resources. Something that is new and emerging in Ghana is going to have been in a classroom in upstate New York for 2 decades.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
in that time frame is narrowing now, but when I was certainly out, in more remote locations, what even language, I will say, if we consider language a technology because it's sort of part of this process, there were books in South Korea that were based on social norms and cultural practices from maybe the 1940s in North America, but they were just arriving into the classroom in South Korea. So that's an example of context in which access to information and updated information or technology makes a huge difference. And so for technology to be considered established, it's really based on that context and I'm almost the social norms. It's all a part of a society,
Yeah.
even if it's a school society that considers that established. And in upstate New York, we have technology that is still brand new, but is established, for example, in New York City.
So, regarding emerging learning technologies, I want to shift our focus to the impact that they have on learning. So, the first question I'll ask is, what do you see as a primary benefit for adopting emerging learning technologies in educational settings?
So I will gently push back and say that impact doesn't always mean it's positive. So
Mm.
I truly am, um, I look at technology, especially emerging technology, like the Amish look at technology and other intrusions from the outside world. And it's not that they do not adopt technology, but they go through a really long discernment process that starts with their core values as a community. And they think, what will the impact be on our relationships, our social structures, and how we do things? So I've loved that. I learned about that perspective maybe 10 years ago, and I thought, well, that kind of captures how I choose to adopt something, so that there's always going to be an impact, and it's not always going to be positive. There's a misunderstanding, I think. There's assumption if technology's there, learning will improve.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the Amish are makers, and they make food. They make a lot of different things, and but they're a community first. So they put everything through that lens. So I often think, okay, Karen, what's your core value in this situation? And then what's your purpose? I don't always think about my core values. If it's about me, I do. But if it's for my students, I think, wait, wait, wait. Are you just adopting this because others are? Or is there a purpose for your students to go through this disruption in their learning to try this out? So I always put it through that screen, I guess, or set of questions. And then I don't know if you remember from the distance learning class, there's a quote from Richard Clark, Dr. Richard Clark. And there was this epic debate in the 80s and 90s between Clark and this other researcher named Kozma about this assumption that technology enhances learning. And the Clark is famous for saying, I wrote down the quote, media are mere vehicles that deliver instruction, but do not influence student achievement any more than a truck that delivers our groceries causes changes in our nutrition.
Mm. That is so
So,
good.
isn't that powerful?
That is so strong. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. So, think about a teacher now who's worried about whether or not, or worried about not knowing AI or generative AI and thinking that their role is going to be minimized.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So it's always about, okay, well, where's the evidence that this way of doing things will enhance learning? So let's explore it. It's not saying don't let it come in, but let's really think about the value added versus what do we lose? What do we gain? What do we lose? So no, there will never be a clear cut binary decision like, oh, this clearly will enhance or this clearly will um, hurt things or be harmful. So I love that lens, and I like the lens of how the Amish decide on things. And to answer your question about, like, really, what are those benefits? And for me, it's about this abundance of information that you and I experience from the moment we wake up
Mm-hmm.
till we go to sleep. And I think technology is a tool that we can use to harness this abundance of information for our purposes. If we're cautious about it and have the luxury of time and are able to press pause, it can really be sort of play any number of roles for helping us to manage this flow of information. That is the first thing that comes to mind. There are many other benefits of it, but that's one of the primary things about funneling, classifying, organizing content that is of value to me at that time.
So with the emerging learning technologies, have you encountered any challenges or obstacles when implementing these technologies, either when you're a classroom teacher or a distance educational instructor? And if so, what did you do to overcome them?
I have. So, as an example, overseas and almost overnight, when I was teaching English language at a university, the decision makers removed all paper and books from the university and said, here's an iPad. All the students will have an iPad. That's how you're going to teach. That's how they're going to learn. So it was a great emerging technology. And at the time, well, even now, I mean, iPads are a great way to consume information. Their strength is not in producing or making things. Um, it can be, but their greatest strength is consuming, and we need learners to harness technology to make things, to make sense of their worlds. And especially at that time, there were not nearly as many apps where you could actually make a lot of things. You know, they had Pages and those other standard apps. So that was the biggest challenge and obstacle for me was how I don't have a photocopier anymore. And my students who normally write from right to left, I've got to help them read and write from left to right.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got an iPad and I can't give them a handout. I can't have them even move their finger along a screen because it's a touch screen that changes every time they touch it. And those haptic elements um, are super important for learning. We have to be able to touch things. So that was one emerging technology at that time that was a huge obstacle because there wasn't this careful process. If you think of that Amish process of what is our purpose, and in English language teaching, there are certain things that can't be achieved through technology.
A hundred
Like for
percent. 100%. I absolutely agree with that. I'm an educational technology specialist student. I love emerging technologies, but I still want like my second grader to open a book and read a
hmm
book. And I still want them to develop fine motor skills and learn how to hold a pencil, not just learn how to type because they need to learn how to write their signature one day. And I feel like those are really important things that I hope that we don't completely lose. So, something we talked about a lot in our instructional design course is accessibility and inclusion. So, how do you think that ELTs can help address individual learning needs and promote personalized learning experiences in educational environments?
This is such a valuable question because in many ways we need learning to be individualized, and in many ways we need learning to be social. So it's about striking that balance because the most effective and deepest learning emerges from really well designed interactions.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you design those? And then, how does technology or emerging technologies facilitate that? And so, I think it's really helpful in the scaffolding and the harnessing of data. So, I can get real time data about a learner if I have the right dashboard and really identify point of need and pair up students in that way, or go in and help or stop an activity and have students come together. And you probably have heard of the Khan Academy initiatives. Salman Khan in California had several model schools where the students were working independently and it was all individualized because it was all adaptive learning software that they
Mm-hmm.
were using. So they were proceeding in ways that were adaptive to that student's need. And then the teacher has the dashboard and can see the progress and intervene as needed. And it's almost like just in time teaching. So I think emerging learning tech in the way it can harness and process data is one of the big game changers for me. because I've always been frustrated with the amount of assessment we do, but we do nothing or certainly not enough with the data we collect.
Mm-hmm.
And I have these arguments behind the scenes with every learning management system. I have rubrics and they all have different categories and all of that. And I'm not going to name our current one as the problem, but with every one, I've thought, okay, I want to see pain points across my students on each criterion. Can't get it. So that to me is not an emerging learning technology that is helping me do what I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those that take data that's, learning data, qualitative and quantitative, that can help me address student needs and then personalize it based on evidence rather than my instinct, then I think that's one of the best uses is the harnessing the data if you can, if you've got it set up properly. And I'll just give you one more example from K-12. When I worked in the United Arab Emirates, I worked on a national testing program. I used to do assessment at this national scale. And then that test, it was an English language test, its role changed in 1 year from just being sort of an entrance exam that would place students within a level in their English courses. They had to take this test to find out what level they would be in when they went to university
Mm-hmm.
because university was in English. And then because it was a really valid and reliable measure, they said, okay, it's going to be an exit exam for high school. So you have to score at a certain level to get your diploma.
Oh my gosh.
And it's an entrance requirement to get into. It's not just about putting you at a level, it's a requirement to get a certain level to get into the university. And then it's this placement test. So countrywide, you can imagine the disruption. It's white people and white people's language making your child and their future determine, sort of those steps. So there was a lot of pressure on us. I worked for the Ministry of Higher Ed, and we started this program. We would go into the schools and help the teachers prepare the students for this test. And you can probably tell where I'm going. My first question was, so I led this professional development program at the national level. My first question was, okay, give me the data from the last 5 years so I can identify where those students are having problems, and we're going to share that data with the high school teachers. And together we'll create many interventions
Mm-hmm.
for these grammar points, this kind of vocabulary, this kind of writing challenge. But they wouldn't release the data. So that's really where it comes in handy, and you can use technology in a beautiful way by just harnessing what it does best,
Mm-hmm.
really fast and in meaningful ways.
Absolutely. So we have talked about ELTs and how they affect learning. So I want to talk now about the integration and implementation of ELTs into a classroom or into like an online learning environment and kind of like the how of all that has worked. So the first thing I want to ask is if you can share some strategies for effectively integrating emerging learning technologies into existing educational frameworks.
I would say backward design really helps me because early on working at SUNY Potsdam, when I had students who were really resistant to what for them was an emerging learning technology, but what for me was something I had been using flexibly for 10 years, I really had to think, okay, backward design, that desired result, how can I make that relevant to this student who says they don't want to use, for example, I used to use LinkedIn and Twitter for certain activities. And I have students create e-portfolios, but this was even before then. And students would say, I will not use media outside the learning management system. It's not of value to me and I'll never use it again. So pretty strong resistance. So I always have to think about what's their why, what's the
Mm-hmm.
value added for them. And I always have thought that through. I don't ever introduce anything without thinking about the connection to the learning outcomes for the course, but the the value to the student. So I go back to values and purpose. I have meetings with students, and over the years have realized, that I can identify in my instructions now. I can say, this is about your career. This is how you might use it. Here are different ways you might use it. Over to you. How do you think you might use it?
Mm-hmm.
So if I don't establish that connection early on, I can't integrate or implement emerging learning technologies effectively. And I've learned the hard way because I've just made assumptions. Oh, you're in an online program, and but you can never make those assumptions. Plus, always start where the learner is. Ask them and be surprised. Be a good listener.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
Yeah, so
as
without
as your
that,
student, I feel like I've definitely felt that, like, you always caring about like our opinions and how things are gonna affect us, and that's something that I feel like a lot of professors need, and it kind of like inspires me because I want to be a classroom teacher first when I graduate, and then follow like the more instructional design after I have that like foundational classroom experience first. So
that's
I think these
awesome.
are all things that you're saying that are really resonating with me that like I need to keep in my toolkit when I'm out there doing it for myself too.
Yeah, it's hard, Kaylee, because you're not always going to hear what you want to hear,
Mhm.
and that's the point, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it won't really be authentic, and as you know, your students can see the minute something is not authentic, that you're just asking it because it's a box to tick or whatever. But
Yep.
I have found out the hard way. Most of what I do is through research and finding out the hard way because I've made an assumption.
How can you assess the effectiveness of the new technology that was implemented?
Yeah, so you have some research skills in your toolkit, and nowadays we use mixed methods, which simply means gather qualitative data and quantitative data. And that qualitative data is really going to tell the story of the implementation. So it's your observation notes, um, handouts, actual artifacts used in the implementation. So you have all of that type of data, plus you have pre and post measures of whatever it is you're trying to move the needle on. But typically, a good mixed methods study has many people involved, especially with the qualitative side, and you will have already identified what it is that you're trying to move the needle on. And in a perfect world you have what's called a randomized controlled experiment, where
Mhm.
you have a control group, an experimental group, and then you compare the two at the end. Um, so that's generally how you do it on a more technical level. And um, when you evaluate everything, you always have to have a measure beforehand, and it has to be a valid measure.
So we've talked a lot about ELTs, how they look today, what they look like in the past. So I want to take some time and talk about what your predictions are for some future trends and what you think kind of they're going to look like. How do you think that they're going to have the most significant impact on education in the next 5 to 10 years?
Really, I tend to look more at a global level and rural level because I live in a rural area of Canada now, um, and I see what the access to broadband internet means.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually is still an emerging technology that is a game changer for everybody. So most people are talking about artificial intelligence, which of course is going to be transformational, but not for the people in rural Ontario if you can't get online even.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, um, bizarrely probably for you, that broadband internet access is going to still have the greatest impact on the next 5 to 10 years because that's a cross generational thing. It's not about being an early adopter or a laggard, it's an absolute need for schools,
Mm-hmm.
for learning, for lifelong learning, for everything you do now. So that still is kind of something that I see that is not an established it's still an emerging technology, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
sadly.
I absolutely believe that because I actually grew up like 45 minutes in the woods. on a dead end road, a
Oh
mile.
my God.
Just, I was in the country. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't grow up with internet. I had dial up until I was like 14 years old. We had a fossil
So cool.
dinosaur computer in our den. And I was probably 16 years old, which was like 2014 when I got Wi-Fi. And it wasn't even Wi-Fi. It was just like the little Verizon box.
Yes.
So it was really just
Yes.
cell phone signal that you could hook a
Wow.
computer to. So I 110% agree with that, because that's, even though internet's been around for a really long time,
Mm-hmm.
how you grow up and where you live can really have such an impact on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when we talk about learning, we can't just talk about where we have the privilege of this access,
Mhm.
right? Because we'll all be working in communities where there just hasn't been that access. Maybe they just got it last week, or it's still coming.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think it's still probably the most it'll have the most significant impact in the next 5 to 10 years.
I think it's going to have the most significant impact, and I think it's the one that's probably the most overlooked too,
I
cuz
agree.
that's
Yes.
that's the first stepping stone, is having internet. So that's,
Yes.
I
Yeah.
love, I love your answer for that. Um, are there any particular trends or developments that you yourself are personally the most excited for?
Yeah, definitely the affordability is a huge trend.
Mm-hmm.
And the notion, I'm really just learning much more about accessibility over the last year. It's always been important to me, but kind of as an add-on because I have so many other varied interests. But the accessibility that is slowly being baked into emerging learning technologies is super important because it's really about casting the widest net for folks to have these opportunities. And also assistive technology for people not in schools but who are lifelong learners, like my parents and folks, for example, living with dementia, and augmented reality. So I know I've got a lot of experience with virtual reality in the design side, but I'm still much more excited about augmented reality because it's low barrier. You don't have to build this beautiful virtual reality world. You can put on certain lenses that have a certain um, tool in front. I don't even know the words anymore, but to help someone who's living on their own, but maybe living with dementia. So
Mm-hmm.
the use of tech to keep people active and independent and able to continue learning if they want to.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, Tony was just talking about a project he does with VR and like senior citizens, and I thought that was
Oh,
so cool. Such an interesting thing, and
yes.
just keeping them learning, keeping them in technology and having cool experiences. I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, it's just like the assumptions people might have made about you in your age and thinking, "Oh, she grew up, she's a digital native, she grew up." And we have people across the age or the lifespan that are super curious about, you know, new tech, emerging
Mhm.
tech, like senior citizens. So,
Yeah,
yeah, I love
absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. Um this question is so
Mm.
important to me, and I am so excited to hear about your opinions, and I know we've talked about this in class some, but with the increasing integration of digital tools and technologies in education, how do you think that the role of educators will evolve, and what new skills or competencies might be required for teaching in the next 25 years?
Mm. So I think what is nice about this is it's nudging all of us out of our comfort zones. And our comfort zones are to be the sage on the stage and to be delivering content because most of us were educated that way. And that's kind of how education has been happening for millennia. You have the knower, and you have a whole classroom of people just learning, trying to find out what the knower knows so that
Yep.
they can repeat it that still happens. So emerging technology forces us out of that important role. We still need to play that role, but there's a continuum again. We've got pedagogy, which is the stage on the stage, and it's direct instruction, which is important. We need that role, that will remain. And then the next role is andragogy, which is not just about adult learning. It's learning where you're not the sage on the stage, you're the guide on the side. But technology is making us take on that role more so. So we've got the pedagogy, teacher at the front of the room, andragogy, teacher beside the student, circulating, observing, guide on the side. And then the last category is something new that a lot of people, not new, but a lot of people haven't heard of, which is Heudagogy, Heupogogy. And that's really where the teacher is one of the resources available to the student, but because of different technologies at their disposal, they can get, choose from this abundance of information around them and then have that teacher as a resource, whether it's a coach, someone to bounce ideas off, someone to keep them focused. And so we have more roles that are yet more interesting, but almost, I have this image of a teacher like this tall at the beginning when the student really needs a lot of guidance, and then same height as the student by their side, and then one of many resources around them. So it's a continuum, and there are names for it, luckily. That pedagogy is super important, and if you've done your job right, by the end of a semester, you're more in that pedagogy role where you're there, but you're almost hovering, as if the student has taken off the training wheels.
Gradual release.
Yeah, yeah. So I see that technology is pushing us and facilitating us to stretch ourselves as educators to take on all three of those roles rather than be so comfortable in that knower role and sage on the stage type of thing.
Just that transition of knowledge, kind of
Yes.
stepping away from that a little bit.
Yeah, and it's you don't stay in pedagogy. You've always, when a new topic comes up, you've got to go back to the front and be the direct instruction person. So it's this iterative, we know that nothing is ever truly just linear and stays in one. So you're always going back to be, the leader in the room. So that's the good thing, which means we'll stay employed.
I was gonna say. Am I still gonna have a job?
You totally will, yes.
That's like, because we talk about our teachers always going to be in the classroom, even for elementary, and it's scary to think about, but I think that there's so much social emotional learning that has to happen with a teacher and with peers that
Hmm.
I can't foresee a future where there's no school or no classrooms anymore.
Yeah, that's a super important point you make, Kaylee. There's so much more to teaching and what goes on in that complex environment, uh, that we play that role. And I really like the word facilitator. I used to kind of roll my eyes like, really, do we need a new term? Really? But it's really, that covers all three roles, right? You're facilitating learning at every stage, but you're not always the one talking.
Okay, so as we wrap up the episode, the last thing that I want to touch on are some final personal insights and recommendations. So, first, I'm wondering if you can share your biggest lessons learned from working with in education and technologies kind of all together.
Sure. So the first, there's no silver bullet or perfect solution. So we're always going to compromise. We always have to give something up to gain more somehow. So I can be pretty idealistic, and I'm just learning sort of to be more mature. Uh, and all disruptions have benefits. So even if it's a negative disruption, boy, oh boy, does that build like this cohesive group because we've gone through it together. It's made us rethink certain things, no matter the outcome. So like you pointed out, and you're really helping me see that again, is that we have this negative connotation associated with disruption. And I always remind myself, you like having your buttons pushed. Don't forget that it's uncomfortable now and you're not sleeping. But when you can find a name for it and you can talk to others about it and move on, it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, as cliche as it sounds, Kaylee, always start with your why and then the purpose. So if it's really a deep disruption or an emerging technology that you're really not certain about, it's valuable to stop and think about your core values. I do that work in when I teach in the business program. In my leadership class, for example, my students identify their core values, and some find it incredibly tough because it should be. But when you filter experiences through those, it helps you to navigate. And you know, emerging learning tech changes our entire world sometimes. So
Yeah.
don't forget who you are, your values, and then stop and say, okay, wait, what is my purpose really? Am I trying to impress other people? Often, yes. And then I put my ego aside and think, no, it will be valuable for these purposes. So peeling back those things are really helpful. And it does sound maybe a bit cliche, but it works. And it ends up when you funnel decisions through your values and then they align with your purpose, you can live with those things you have to give up or whatever you know the risks are that you're taking.
Absolutely. And those are things that I definitely need to keep in mind myself as I am finishing up this degree and then making my
Mm.
big step into the education world and as I'm a teacher, and those are all things I definitely want to keep in the forefront of my mind. We talked about like balancing technology but then also like being a human. So from your perspective, what are some essential considerations for maintaining that balance between technical innovations and maintaining a human centered approach to education?
That is a tough question for me because I'm not so good at balance. But it's about being able to say no and having. So I talked about how I'm always up for asking questions. I'm not so good at saying no, even when I know that has to be said. So being comfortable with that, being comfortable with not everybody being happy. That's like it is a consideration because you're never going to please everybody. And that diffusion of innovation helps us to know that you're going to have those early adopters and you're going to have those laggards. And so you've got to have the emotional intelligence for that. And so it's really about how you process it and have measured expectations for whatever innovation you're going to bring in and disrupt folks with.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how well you know from the research and best practice that it's going to work, there will always be resistance and it's valid. Um, so being human centric is really about recognizing, you know, that symbol for nuclear energy, like all those different things going all over the place.
Uh huh.
That's how I envision like my student in their world. I'm just one little piece. They're at the center, and we're in this classroom, this really protected environment and controlled. And um, the more I remind myself that that student has, you know, isn't a statistic. It isn't, you know, they're not um, a category. And they're on this same journey. And you've just helped me to see that, oh, yeah, not everybody had broadband when in the last 10 years. So you're a young student, and I assumed you were a digital native and had all of these bells and whistles at your disposal, and you're an ed tech coach.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's being careful about assumptions and asking questions, giving students choice, all of those things.
So, my last question for you today is based on your experiences, what advice would you give to anybody listening regarding technology, having an itchy brain, and how to be a lifelong learner?
Recognize that, you know, there's no silver bullet, and enlist others to join you on that journey. And it gets to be contagious. when you show you're vulnerable and curious, people will be open to exploring research with you if you show that you don't understand everything and you're learning with them.
Mm-hmm.
People just need to feel that they contribute, and you give them that dignity of active listening and listening to understand, not just listening to respond. And then you've got a whole team building towards this disruption.
Mm-hmm.
And, and yeah, so folks will have buy-in. They will, understand at least, they'll understand the why, and it won't be like an overnight decision. And I truly do go back to the Amish and their notion, their process of, you know, putting it through those filters, and then you make a decision together. What is the effect on us, not just on me? Like it might give me accolades, but it's disrupting everybody around me. You know what I mean? So that
Mm-hmm.
our egos get involved too. So yeah, just be yourself and your curiosity and um, willingness to take a risk. All of that. People are attracted to that because they can then feel vulnerable and ask those important questions that will take you in the directions you need to go.
Absolutely. As we conclude this insightful episode of SUNY Potsdam's Learning Design podcast, I want to extend a huge thank you to our guest, Dr. Karen Caldwell, for sharing her experiences and giving visions for the future of learning. And we've explored fascinating insights on emerging learning technologies and their impact on education. So thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate you so much.
Haley, I totally got so much out of this. You always push my thinking. So thank you for
Of course.
everything you do. You learn out loud and yeah, you're just a joy to learn with.
Thank you. I have linked your LinkedIn profile, the video from your TEDx SUNY Potsdam, and your Itchy Brain blog for anybody who wants to check that out. And until next time, goodbye.